Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Risk Matrix, another episode with James Junkin and me, Dr. Martin.
Roll Tide, Roll Tide.
Roll Tide. You're in the Matrix, baby, as James likes to say. And this is another episode with just James and I shooting the breeze. We've got a topic today. We're going to talk about organizational culture and psychological safety assessments, of which he and I have partnered on a bunch of these recently. And we'd like to just talk about the mechanics of what we do and how we do it and what you should be looking for um, in that manner. And we did on a previous episode, James, have Dr. Daniels on talking about psychosocial hazards and psychological safety. He's the expert in the field. But again, we've been in this area for a while too now, and have found some pretty surprising results. But before we get started, Mr. James, I'd like to read a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Risk Matrix, powered by Veriforce, is sponsored by Mariner Gulf Consulting and Services. Occupational safety and health policies and procedures represent the foundation of a functioning and executable safety management system. Using a customized approach, Mariner Golf's technical writing experts work with your team to develop customized safety policies and procedures that meet regulatory standards, third-party verification system requirements, industry best practices, and have withstood hundreds of hiring client audits and OSHA inspections. To learn more, visit marinergolf.veriforcenetwork.com. I think you know those guys, James.
I might know those folks over there on the technical writing team at Mariner Gulf, but we try to do a good job for you.
They do a good job. I've actually consulted with you on a few things with your technical writing team, and they're great. So let's talk about this. We had Dr. Daniels on previous episode that ran before this, and we talked to him about his area of expertise, which he wrote his dissertation on, psychosocial hazards and psychological safety. But I think what we want to talk about today, and again, we can take this whatever direction you want, is how this comes into play with figuring out what is going on in organizational culture, and how to kind of direct your efforts to I don't know if fix is the right term, but address some of the issues that may be hindering people from speaking up or from feeling safe within their environment. And we're not talking physically safe; we're talking psychologically safe.
Can translate into being not say physically, right? So,
Right.
when we think about psychological safety, we have to go back to its roots in a management philosophy to get people to speak up so that new ideas come forth. And that's how we get innovation. That's how we mitigate risk. And the word safety in it really was about the individual feeling safe to express their opinions, their thoughts, their ideas. As safety professionals, we hear safe. We're like, how does that work within our dynamic? Well, one of the ways I think that we talk about it that it applies is the most common question surrounding stop work authority and stop work obligation. Post incident, almost invariably, if it involves multiple people or multiple organizations, somebody's going to ask the question, why did no one stop the job? Right? And so psychological safety in some aspects seeks to address that potential of a block, if you will, that keeps people from exercising their stop work authority, their stop work obligation.
So, we've run into this, right? Post-incident, one of the things, and usually in the more serious ones is where we kind of come in and we've partnered on these psychological safety assessments. We've used some instruments to kind of look at what people's perceptions are and kind of how they feel about the organization, because it really is organizational. It's not safety culture, and that was a whole nother couple episodes that we've had. It's organizational culture, right? And organizational culture often impedes people's ability to do the things that you talked about: speak up, stop work, feel safe, all of these different things. And these tools that we employ, the surveys, the questionnaires, the interviews, they look at, are we thinking that all the perceptions are the same when they're not? Are we thinking that everybody thinks the same way when they're not? What demographics are thinking differently? How are we being perceived when we say stop work? All of these different things come into play, and they can be real, right? I mean, an assessment that brought out that even though we were translating for different ethnicities and people that speak different languages, the message wasn't communicated in the right way, and they weren't feeling that that was enough to stop work or their background and culture.
Well, I
So
think we have to fully define what it is. Let's talk about what it's not. A simple questionnaire that we've all seen around quote unquote safety culture may not produce statistically valid results. Okay.
right.
We've all seen the safety culture surveys and we've all taken them, and some of us have used them in the past. I've used them in the past, right? That is not this. Now, you're the expert, Dr. Martin, in research. Let's talk about why you need to dig deeper using a psychological safety assessment and organizational culture assessment tool to produce statistically valid results. What are statistically valid results?
That's the $100 million question, right? It depends on your population, and it depends on what your question is, right? Because all research starts with some type of question, a research question, and then hypotheses about what might be wrong, okay, or what might be right, or what's the null and what's the what it just depends, which you love when I say that, right? But it depends on the population, right? If you have a 10-person organization, then your tool might not be as in depth, or you might be able to do just interviews. It depends. If you have hundreds of employees and the populations of ethnicities are different, it just depends. You have to be sampling within the population representative of all of those different demographics that you want to look at. Okay, so I'm sorry to say it's statistically valid. It just depends, right? It depends on many different things. So let's say, for example, there are some bigger companies out there that say, hey, take our 10 question culture survey and we'll tell you what's wrong with your system. That's probably not statistically valid, right? It's a good tool to get people into um, doing more work with you, but it's not a psychological safety assessment in the true sense of you're actually looking at the population, sampling the right number of people within the demographics that you're looking at, and really doing the statistical analysis to get to the root of the problem, right? And then it's not stopping there, okay? And we've gone through this before, that there are some open-ended questions that come into play about psychological safety that you might want to dive deeper into and conduct interviews. Dr. Daniels himself in his research, while he did do some pre-screening for his dissertation, and again, I can't, I'm not his, I was dissertation advisor, but I didn't do his research. He followed up with interviews, detailed interviews, similar to what we do, because everybody's different, right? You can get to kind of the root of the problem, but you really need to talk to the people on the ground to find out what their perceptions are.
So a
Um,
canned survey, for example, may give you some initial results, but it doesn't dig deep enough to root out the demographic issues that you may have in a diverse organization across a wide variety of geographical regions, age groups, ethnicity, sex, all that. Is that what you're
right.
telling me?
That's what I'm telling you, okay? And I'm also saying that, and Dr. Daniels said this as well, right? we're on a trendy subject here, right? It's popping up everywhere. You've said this, right? SIFs and psychological safety are on every slate of speakers at every conference within the last couple years, right? But that doesn't mean that just because somebody is giving you something for free as part of their system, right, to show you that you might have a problem, it doesn't mean it's statistically valid, and it doesn't mean that it's really measuring what you say it's measuring, right? Because that becomes a problematic in research as well. So if you want research that's defensible, that you can take with you and you can use to actually put corrective actions in place, you really need to be looking at something from the standpoint of a researcher and not somebody who's just taking something off the shelf.
Well, I
Because
think
every
we
population
found
is different.
in our assessments that we've done with you is we might start off with a question: do you know that you have the right to stop work? Well, everybody says yes, right? But how does my supervisor make me feel? How do my coworkers make me feel? How do am I supported when I do these things? And so we may be asking the same question, but
In a
by
different way.
asking it in a different way, you can get to deeper perception. Now, I want to ask you this. We've utilized this tool in response to serious injury and fatality incidents to determine whether or not there's a problem within the organizational culture that contributed to this incident, namely trying to ask the question, why did the employee do what they did, number one, and why did nobody stop them, number two?
Mhm.
That's been very
And if
effective.
this is a systemic problem, right? Because
Right.
I mean, if they're thinking this was right, and no, and the other people thought they didn't want to stop them, then there, if an incident happens in the future, is the same thing going to happen again, right? With the same demographic or a similar demographic. And I want to jump back to the questioning, right? The questions are phrased such that you ask a question a different way. Sometimes you ask it in the positive, sometimes you ask it in the negative, so that you can compare the answers and look at some kind of validity of whether or not you're seeing what you think you're seeing, right? Because sometimes, and this happens a lot in surveys, right? You can take a survey and people interpret questions differently. So you have to be very careful about the way questions are phrased. Um, but we've used this, like you said, we've used this to look at how do you get to the crux of what do you need to correct, right? Is it systemic? Is it not systemic? Right? And the only way that you can kind of get to the answer to that question is to see if multiple people, a statistically valid sample of the population, feel the same way.
And I will say this, most people think and they come to it and say, well, do you have a organizational culture that protects people psychologically so that they feel like they can speak up, i.e., stop the job? And most people will say, of course we do. We train on it. It's a component of our training. We have a policy on it. We've never disciplined anybody formally or had retribution for people that are doing that. But I think what our research has surprisingly seen is even though that's the thought process at the executive level, that may not be how everybody within the organization feels. If 90% of the people in the organization feel the same way as the CEO and they can do that, that's great. But what about that 10% segment and the critical
And
activity?
how do you fix that, right? How do you work on that with that population, right? And we also talked about this on our Dr. Daniels episode, that some of these things are very intensely personal, right? That you may have one or two people that feel this way, but when it becomes 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, depending on the size of your population, it makes a big difference, right? And it puts more risk into your system. This is the risk matrix, right? It puts more risk in your system. And it really is organizational culture is something you have to work on. It's not, and again, it's not safety culture, it's organizational culture. Because what comes from the top, right, is that stop work authority, speak up, brother's keeper. These things are they go to everything in the organization, not just safety, right? They go to fiscal responsibility and productivity and all those other things too. So the root of the problem is the organization. And if it's more a statistically valid sample of that population that feel that way, and you find that that may have contributed to the incident or accident, then you need to do something to fix it.
And I think the other thing that we use these for is to validate companies. Companies that are doing really well
Right.
in this, and say they're the percentage of people within the organization that feel challenged and unable to exercise or stop work authority or unsupported or whatever is statistically insignificant compared to the vast number of other people we've surveyed in this comprehensive survey, right? And I think
Mhm.
that looks really good when you go back to your hiring client or to OSHA post incident to say, we're going the extra mile.
Mhm.
We're at the cutting edge of the technology and the data research for psychological safety. We're ultimately concerned about the well-being of the people in our organization and their ability to voice whatever safety concerns they have. And it is nice not just to say it, but to be able to produce a report that has some validation to that, right?
Mhm.
So,
Right.
especially if you're going to exert an unpreventable employee misconduct defense.
Right, right. And I will say this because I mentioned interviews too, right? And mentioned open-ended questions, right? Because it's not just a Likert scale type thing, and you have your answers. But a lot of times we've asked open-ended questions, and some of the answers are surprising. Some of them are, you always get the guy who's kind of, or the guy or gal that's kind of saying something kind of uh cute or mean or whatever, but a lot of times you'll get in an anonymous open-ended question, you'll get some really good ideas for improvement, right? Or some examples that you didn't know were happening of things in the organization. So that's important. If you have an authentic interviewer, somebody who's a third party, who is, on anonymity, I can't say that word, but they're asking you questions, they can gather information for you on why people are feeling this way and perhaps provide you with that information. But again, that comes into, all these other things about, people feeling safe about the person that's interviewing them. Anonymous surveys and open-ended questions can tell you a lot.
The companies I represent, Dr. Martin, are very diverse in country of origin, and English is either a second language, sometimes not even a language. A lot of our workforce has Hispanic workers. Some of them are bilingual, some of them are not. How important it is when you're assessing an organization for psychological safety and cultural, you know, organizational assessment that you conduct. How important it is to get someone that understands the nuance of translation for the question.
Oh, I mean, it's infinitely important, right, James? Uh, what I say in English to a non-English speaker is interpreted vastly differently. We talked about Spanish, right? Um, Spanish from Guatemala, Spanish from other areas of the country, Mexico, they're different. Even within the United States, the dialects are different. And so it's very important to have somebody who's skilled at translation go through the process with you and translate those survey questions into the same intent as best you can, right? I mean, a bilingual worker who is probably, or bilingual translator in that dialect, the main dialect is probably the best, right? Sometimes you can take that translation that you got from a professional translator and sit down with a trusted employee and go through the questions and talk through what the nuances are. that need to be changed, and you can do that. You can try a sample population. It just depends on how big of a population you have to survey. You get to validity, right, by using the right language. And we can't just assume that if we ask something in English and we use just any bilingual worker to translate, that we're going to get to as close as we can to what we're asking. Different dialects, different English speaking workers, people from Canada. I mean, it just depends. So you have to be very careful about how you phrase things.
So that would take some level of expertise.
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, and as you know, we've used professional translators before, and then worked with workers to go ahead and make sure that we're as close as we can to what's being spoken in the workplace.
And I assume by using this technique, we're able to drill down through different demographic groups, through age, sections of age, experience, departments, to get to where the issue may or may not be within an organization.
The bigger the population, the better the sample, the more precise the instrument, right? It helps with the validity of what we're getting. Now, demographics plays a big role. You can't just ask, well, what's your gender, what's your age, right? We ask a lot of different things. Like you said, we ask department, we ask job role, we ask native
Experience.
language. We what?
Experience.
Experience level, right? Um, and all of those things can be parsed out depending on how big the sample is that you get from the population. You can parse those things out and make different conclusions based on what's statistically valid and not about what could be coming into play as problems within that uh, company.
And I think that's great because if we go back to the episode with Dr. Daniel's focus was on the individual, the individual. And I don't know how you get to the individual or a subset of individuals with a targeted plan for corrective action unless you know exactly what segment of your organization has that need. I don't think
Has the problem, right? You
mm-hmm.
got to narrow it down. You got to narrow it down somehow, right? And a 10 question survey, a quick survey that somebody offers you for free as part of whatever service you're getting, it is really not going to get you there, right? And, I mean, I hate to say this. I know it sounds enticing, but sometimes it's if you have a larger organization or you really think you have a problem, it's better to kind of go down that route of something that you know is going to give you a narrower result that you can kind of rely on to get to the individuals, right? To get to the individuals that are having a problem. And more often than not, in a big organization, you will get to a couple different areas that you can work on, a couple of different populations of people that you can work on, whether it's older workers, younger workers, workers of a certain ethnicity, workers that speak a certain language, workers within a department. Sometimes it depends on the leadership in that area. But you can't get there unless you look at all those things to narrow it down, and you can't get to the individual unless you go through the population.
So rather than, I've used this, you use this in response to answer the question of why did the employee do what they did and why did no one stop them? Could this also be used, like we're heading into 2024, as a benchmark for later data research to evaluate corrective actions, improvements, and things that you're doing?
Absolutely. You should be doing it probably I mean I would suggest annually, right? If you're really looking at this and you're thinking that you may have a problem in your organizational culture, or even if you don't think you have a problem in your organizational culture, right? You start by looking at what you have, and then you use it as a benchmark for the next time, right? Because certainly the way you find out if what you're doing is working is to look again, right? And look again and keep drilling down until you get to a place where you're probably maybe not looking every year, you're looking every couple years because your organizational culture is getting better based on what you're doing. So yes, it's a benchmark, but it's also a tool for continuous improvement.
Absolutely, which meets every management systems need that's out there, right?
I think so, right? Dr. Daniels said, and I think he's right in this, that the US is kind of behind. I mean, we practice in the US, so I'm just going to go there. We're kind of behind other countries, and Europe and a lot of the different Asian countries that we're way behind them on psychological safety. Australia, New Zealand, right? And we need this. We need this. And as he said, it's not hard, right? We just have to start.
We just need to start. Absolutely. And I think it's a good place to end up right here on this particular session of the risk matrix. Psychological safety assessments, cultural organizational assessments, definitely something that's cutting edge in the research. A lot of people are talking about how to implement psychological safety within our organizations. And I say you can't implement it till we know where we are, right? And you have
Right.
benchmarks related to valid statistical research. Thank you, Dr. Martin. And thank you for those of you that come and enjoy our podcast. It's over there still on YouTube. They come out every Tuesday. Go to that YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button, smash that like button for us so we can know that you were there. You also listen to us on Spotify, riding down the road as you ride safely and not distracted. No distracted driving to watch the risk matrix, but a lot of people enjoy it when they're in their vehicle. So every Tuesday, new episodes. And until next time, y'all keep bringing those workers home safe.